A business identifies a critical problem. Employee turnover is accelerating, or profit margins across regional branches are wildly inconsistent. Recognizing chaos exists is easy. Extracting the exact cause and snapping it into a strict mathematical grid to prove a solution is incredibly difficult. Bridging the gap between an observed problem and an empirical solution requires a rigid, deterministic framework. In applied science, this is known as the research design. It is the exact blueprint for how data will be collected, measured, and analyzed. Without this blueprint, any attempt to gather information is merely noise. Asking employees why they are leaving might yield interesting anecdotes, but it will not produce verifiable data capable of driving systemic corporate strategy. There is no single perfect method for discovering the truth. Instead, the quality of a scientific investigation relies entirely on how a researcher navigates a system of 5 interconnected structural choices. These 5 dimensions are research strategy, the extent of researcher interference, the study setting, the unit of analysis, and the time horizon. A researcher must deliberately balance the demand for rigorous scientific proof against the real-world constraints of available time, corporate access, and capital. Designing a study is an exercise in optimization. This diagram maps the complete architecture of research design. The first critical dimension is the research strategy. Based on the objective, an investigator must choose an operational plan. Options range from highly controlled experiments and broad survey research to deeply focused case studies. The second and third dimensions dictate the environment. The researcher must determine the extent of interference, how much they will manipulate the variables, and the study setting, deciding whether the investigation occurs in a natural workspace or an artificial environment. The fourth dimension defines the unit of analysis. This establishes exactly who or what is being measured at the point of data aggregation. Finally, the system locks in the fifth dimension, the time horizon. This dictates whether the data is captured in a single frozen moment or tracked across multiple collection periods. These are not isolated menus. They form a deeply interconnected system. Selecting an experiment in the strategy column dictates a specific level of interference, which subsequently restricts the options available for the study setting and time horizon. Every choice mathematically limits the next. Understanding how these gears interlock ensures that conclusions are drawn from evidence rather than assumption. Mastering this architecture separates empirical science from corporate intuition. If a researcher only needs to know whether 2 variables move together in a natural environment, they conduct a correlational study. The defining rule of this approach is minimal interference. Consider a bank manager trying to understand client deposit patterns. They can observe the current interest rates and compare against the volume of savings account deposits across their branches. Look at this photograph of a standard office environment, representing a non-contrived setting. Subjects go about routine functioning without disruption or awareness of the researcher. Extracting data from this environment proves that high interest rates and high deposits exist at the same time. It does not prove that the interest rate caused the deposits to rise. External factors, like local economic conditions, could be responsible for the change. To prove causation, the researcher must deliberately manipulate the independent variable. They must interfere. If the manager runs a field experiment, they might artificially set the interest rate to 9% in one branch, 8% in another, and leave a third unchanged. The setting remains natural, but the variables are now actively controlled. Even with this moderate interference, the natural world is chaotic. One branch might happen to be located in a neighborhood with more retirees who have higher disposable income. That external demographic factor could easily contaminate the data. To establish a cause and effect relationship beyond doubt, the researcher must strip away the natural environment entirely. They require a lab experiment.
In a contrived setting, 40 business students of the exact same age and financial background are placed in isolated rooms. They are given artificial chips counting for $1,000 and offered highly controlled, varying interest rates to see how they save. Age, location, and income are neutralized. This design requires excessive interference. The environment is entirely artificial. You cannot have both absolute control and absolute reality. Establishing definitive causation inherently demands sacrificing the natural environment for the sterility of the laboratory. The precision of any study relies on the unit of analysis. A researcher must define the exact level of aggregation before they collect a single response. Data properties change depending on scale. Individuals possess characteristics like personal stamina. Groups possess cohesiveness and hierarchical structure. You cannot measure a department's stamina. The baseline resolution is the individual. If a chief financial officer needs to know how many staff members want to attend an investment seminar, the data is collected and analyzed one employee at a time. This visualization illustrates the shift to a dyad. If human resources measures a mentorship program, they analyze the mentor and mentee as a single paired unit. Moving up the scale, evaluating a software installation requires analyzing distinct groups, like sales versus production. Individual responses are subsumed into the collective group mean. At the macro level, a corporation tracking profit margins treats entire countries, like Germany or Spain, as single data points, aggregating regional offices into one massive variable. Moving up this ladder exponentially increases the cost and complexity of the sampling process. The level of aggregation dictates exact rules of investigation. The final constraint on the blueprint is time. The researcher must decide if the problem requires a static snapshot or an evolving timeline. A cross-sectional study gathers data at one single point in time to answer an immediate question. Look at this image of a trading floor. If a researcher surveys stockbrokers specifically between April and June to assess concerns during a turbulent market, that data is locked to that specific quarter. It is a one-shot effort to capture a frozen moment. By contrast, a longitudinal study gathers data on the same dependent variable at multiple distinct points in time. It measures a baseline, allows time to pass, and measures again. Because proving causation requires manipulating a variable and observing the effect, causal experimental designs are inherently longitudinal. They require a clear before and after. Tracking variables across months or years introduces immense resource costs. However, extending the time horizon is the only structural choice capable of revealing genuine behavioral change. In applied business research, the flawless longitudinal lab experiment is rarely an option. Isolating employees, manipulating their wages, and studying them for a year is too expensive, too slow, and highly disruptive to actual operations. Researchers are forced into an optimized trade-off. They deliberately sub-optimize the rigor of their design, settling for cross-sectional field studies or smaller sample sizes to meet the practical constraints of capital and corporate access. To counter the weakness of these compromised designs, investigators deploy mixed methods research, attacking the problem using both quantitative metrics and qualitative observation. This demonstrates triangulation. Rather than relying on a single suboptimal method, researchers use multiple data collection methods to address the same problem from overlapping angles. If surveys, field studies, and interviews all yield the exact same empirical result, despite methodological flaws, the underlying truth solidifies. Professional research design is not about achieving absolute laboratory perfection. It is the deliberate, mathematical calculation of acceptable error margins. By navigating strategy, interference, setting, scale, and time, a researcher deploys the optimal structural blueprint required to extract an actionable truth from a highly chaotic world.